Okay. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this world. So today we're going to talk about evolution, which is a big topic, a lot going on, and we're kind of going to, speed run through a lot of details, and then we're eventually going to get to the part that's sort of more directly related to like the human movement part. So arguably this is about the evolution of human movement. I know AI updates, I'm working on some stuff, but nothing that has actually produced something shareable. So we'll get there either next week or the week after, we'll figure it out. So let's go ahead and I just feel like there's more to say at the beginning. Is there anything to say? Semester's coming to an end. There is a sort of 2 or 3, 4 classes left. No one knows.
Maybe 3 after this.
After this, I think it's like either 3 or 4. But
next week, Thanksgiving week.
Yeah, Thanksgiving week is going to be kind of like a fake week because I'll do stuff that will be relevant, but I know how this goes. So I'll try to make that non-essential, not that any of this is. So maybe next week will be the one where I talk about my actual research, because I think this is the hypothetically, like the not the culmination, but like I think once I'm done with this stuff, you will have at least hypothetically sufficient background. I will have said sufficient background to be able to talk about my research with at least not most of it being completely new. So we'll see. We'll figure it out. I'll just show up and try not to fall asleep. But if you do, I understand you're tired. Okay. So starting from the beginning, Big Bang, boom. Universe explodes. That's kind of where we start from. So the Big Bang is our current culturally preferred creation myth. It is like all good creation stories. It explains a lot, but it doesn't explain everything. The Japanese, at one point in their history, thought that Japan was formed by a giant sword stabbed in, and then the droplets makes, where the drops fell, that's where the islands fell. Doesn't explain a ton, but it does explain why the islands are the way that they are. The Genesis 1:1 vision of the world is that God made light because it was dark, and then he made a bubble because the ancient Hebrews thought that we were in like an infinite ocean, so he made firmament for the ground and then fixed stars for the top, and then that's where we lived. And then people eventually were like, wait, but there's all these, like the fixed stars don't move, but there's these ones that do move. Those are probably planets, so maybe we're in spheres, and so the planets are the spheres, and the outer sphere is the fixed stars. And then Galileo invented the telescope and looked at Jupiter and was like, wait, there's something orbiting that one too, so maybe we're orbiting the sun. And then eventually we sort of got better and better telescopes, got better and better data. We started noticing weird things like the universe is expanding. That's strange. Everywhere we look, things are moving away from us. And if you think about yourself as like a dot in a grid on the outside of a balloon, everywhere you would look, things would be expanding. So Hubble, looking around, not the guy, but the telescope, saw that kind of stuff happening. We invented things called radio telescopes. We saw this thing called the background radiation. And if you extrapolate all those things out, then if you sort of play the clock back, then about 12 billion years ago or so, everything is going to be in the same place. And what comes before that? Well, we don't really know. What comes after that? Everything that we do know. Or not really, what comes before that we don't know, / within this cosmology, there's no way to discuss that question. And so the Big Bang explains a lot, but it doesn't explain everything. For example, if it was just that simple big boom story, where we would look, things would be slowing down. They're not, they're speeding up. If we had a good sense of where all the energy lived in the world, we could look at galaxies and predict their speed. We can't, we're off by like 70%, and we call the difference dark energy. So we know that this cosmology is not like true, but we believe that it is more true than the previous things because it helps us make better and more precise predictions. That's Karl Popper's long and short of philosophy of science, and we'll go with it for now. So, Big Bang explodes. All the energy in all the universe of all time is created in that moment, so we say. Remember when people talk about things like the, what's it called? Conservation of energy? That's the energy that they're talking about. And the thought is that there was a bunch of something happened, there was a bunch of matter, a bunch of antimatter, it obliterated itself, and the obliterated matter-antimatter became all the energy in the universe, mostly in the form of light, which is just part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And for some strange reason, when that thing happened, there was some left over. There was some matter left over. And if you're curious about that, Emily Noether is a physicist of old, back lady scientist before that was okay, who looked at symmetry breaking math in physics. So the question of why there's anything left over, that's what she's talking about. That's, who knows, but here we are. So there was clearly something left that did not obliterate itself, and that's roughly the stuff that we're standing on. So, big explosion 12 billion years ago. And for a good little while, everything is too hot to do anything useful. As the universe expands, the gases cool down, and things start to form shapes. Your positrons and your electrons and all your quarks and nonsense sort of started showing up. Eventually it gets bigger. That stuff cools down even further, and you get things like protons and electrons. They meet up and become hydrogen, and this is where we start getting closer to biology. Hydrogen, good start. So those hang out in the form of nebulae, which are big cloud-like things, and they're made out of matter. Matter has gravity, so that you get a big cloud, it's going to start to condense on itself. So the clouds start to condense until eventually they get so smushed in that they get super hot, and the hydrogen fuses into helium. It's called fusion because it fuses together. Hydrogen into helium is a super energetic explosion, and so it fights against the collapsing gravity of the nebula and explodes outwards, and that sort of equilibrium of explosion and collapsing is what we call stars. That is also the origin of our good friend helium. Not particularly useful in biology. That's you get one hydrogen, put them together, you get 2 atomic weight, that's helium. So for a good while, that's all we got to. Just a bunch of hydrogen nebulae fusing into stars that are burning hydrogen to get helium. And then that goes on for a while until some of the stars start to burn out all of their hydrogen and are left with nothing but helium. When that process stops, the helium stars now collapse because it takes more energy to fuse helium than it does to fuse hydrogen, but they collapse so hard that they get so hot that it fuses into like beryllium or something like that, which is a less energetic process, but it's enough to fight the collapse, and you get a new type of stars. That process continues. They burn through their subsequent elements, and you get basically all the chemistry that we need for regular old biology, the top row on the periodic table. What's it called? Periodic table. Yeah. So you got your hydrogen, you got your helium, you got your lithium, you got your beryllium, and you got, these are all of our very good friends here. Once you get to oxygen, you start getting a ton of water. Hydrogen plus oxygen equals water. It's one of the most common things in the universe. And that process of the stars burning through their fuel and doing fusion in less and less efficient methods works all the way up until about iron. And once you get to iron and you start trying to do fusion on iron, that process is not strong enough to produce the explosive force you need to stop the collapsing of the star. And then the star collapses all the way. And for some stars that are big enough, they do this kind of wacky thing where as they're collapsing, they hit that fusion point for the lighter stuff, and it kind of like slam, 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 and then eventually explode in the form of supernovae. And whereas the first part can take millions and millions and millions and millions of years, that last part of the supernova part takes like 2 weeks, which is fucked up. But anyways, That's where all the rest of this stuff comes from. And that's how all of this stuff gets out into the universe. So now we've got a universe with elements in it. Those elements continue to cool down until eventually they form these accretion disks, and some of those accretion sort of silicates, or this first silicone, forms rocky planets. We live on one of those rocky planets. The ground is from those stars. So whenever you hear people say like, oh, we're made of star stuff, stardust, that's what they're talking about. So, yeah, and so that's step one. That's how you get planets. Planets are very important for evolution, probably. They're at least, in one case, a sufficient condition. So, you get solar systems. Solar systems have planets. Some of them are big gas giants like your Jupiters and your Neptunes. Some of them are small, rocky sort of chunks like Earth and Mars and folks like that. For the majority of Earth's existence, it was not habitable to anything at all. It's hot, it's magma, it's very sort of, it's hot magma and it's got no atmosphere, so it's getting hit by solar radiation. Bad time, bad news. Nothing really, no complex chemistry can really show up in that space because it's too violent. But if you recall, there's a lot of water in the world, a lot of water in the universe. Hydrogen is the first guy on the show. Oxygen is not far after. And so there are some stellar bodies out there that just do nothing but spit out 1 trillion times the amount of water on Earth every second for 1 billion years. If you go flying around in space, you're going to find a lot of rocks of water ice. Eventually, the Earth sort of clears out its orbit because it's all the parts just clump up together. So you get less meteorite impacts, which is good for life. And you also get a lot of water because a lot of those chunks are chunks of ice. And so you start to get things like oceans. Oceans are super useful things for life because they're water. So if they're liquid water, then their temperature range is sort of like reasonable. And they're also very good at blocking radiation. So we live on the surface of our planet, so we mostly rely on air of various forms to block our radiation, along with our Earth's magnetic field does a pretty good job with the solar wind. Another great solution, if you don't have a good atmosphere, is live underwater. And so if you're curious about, not to follow up here, but like there are places most of the water in the solar system is not on Earth. It is on a combination of moons, the Jovian moons, Enceladus, Europa. These are ice moons that have a thick sheath of ice, and beneath that sheath of ice, we have recently discovered we have geologically active planets and warm water oceans. So who knows what's hanging out in there? Anyway, so here we are on Earth. It's hot, it's bad there, a lot of radiation, but we've got oceans. And so once we get into the oceans, we can start to form various goop. Goop is a good precursor to life. I don't know much about this. I'm sure there's much more that can be said about the specifics of this goop, but at some point the goop becomes fancy goop. And the fancy goop is, I'm going to say roughly speaking, RNA, ribonucleic acid. mRNA, I guess it's not an M because it's got nothing to message, but RNA is a very important type of goop because it is self-replicating. Self-replication, like just the nature of the orientation of the who's-its and the what's-its, the hexagons and sticks and the carbons and the hydrogens that came from the stars, it makes copies of itself. Wild move, how we got the goop we kind of understand. It's just stuff goops up. Like a lot of the nebulae that are out there are like literally ethanol. Like you could go scoop some up and drink it and get drunk. Like fancy chemistry is not hard to find. And you put it together, it gets goop. That thing where it becomes this self-replicating molecule, who knows? It could just be a numbers game. Like you just let it hang out for long enough in a place that is protected from radiation and meteors and too hot of temperatures and things like that. and you just get things like RNA? Who knows? I don't, but I know that in at least one case, it is possible to happen at least one time. And that is called the anthropic principle, which is the concept that we know that the universe is capable of creating supporting life, because if it wasn't, then I wouldn't really be able to ask the question. So in at least one case, at least one time, and at least one planet that roughly resembles this one, it is possible for something like RNA to emerge. And once you have something like RNA, the process of evolution can begin. Because when you have something that replicates, it will replicate imperfectly. And so that starts off this kind of genetic algorithm, which is a fun thing to Google. It's like genetic algorithms are kind of a computer science term, but they're based off of basic evolution. And the idea is that if you have something self-replicating, and it's self-replicating with variation, some of those variations will be better at surviving than other of those variations. And if the mutations are heritable, then that process kicks off a pretty interesting cascade of events leading up to and including this moment right now. So now you've got self-replicating mRNAs. Eventually, they form into things what we might call cells. I will show a animation in a second, but we'll go through this with words for now. Cells are basically a shell. You make a membrane, lipid bilayer if you're into that kind of stuff, and now you have invented something very interesting in the history of life, and that is an inside and an outside. There's a part that is sequestered from the rest of the universe, and it has its own sort of situation going on the inside, which is separated from the outside, which is everything else. You are also one of these types of thing. The cells are pretty lame for a while. It's like archaea, which they don't have organelles. They just kind of like float around. This might, somewhere in this process, you get light sensitivity. That's where eventually that's eventually this kind of stuff. Light sensitivity, once you start having things that have inside and outside, you might say they have a sense, that's an organism. And that organism, at some point, will start developing the ability to sense the environment, absorb some environmental energy, convert it into some internal state, and then at some other point, put force into the world that will allow it to change its position relative to everything else. Chemosensation is thought to be the first sense. That's smell, the ability to sense chemical gradients. It's like, hey, there's food in this direction. I'm going to go there. Oh, that's poison. I'm going to go this way. That's smell, chemosensation. At some other point, light sensitivity is somewhere on the list of senses we picked up. And it's thought that the first origins of light sensitivity was in like plankton-like objects that might want to go up when the sun is up and go down when the sun is down. So all you need to do is to have something in your body that absorbs photons and have some other chemical process that moves in the direction of that thing. Or maybe you're in the water so you don't even go in the direction of light, you just go up. Who knows? This is now, at some point here, we also develop directionality. You have forward, that's a good, useful thing. We started with inside. We started with everything. Then we have inside. Now we have forward. Good start. Eventually we get better cells. Archaeas and your basic bacteriums, sort of, the majority of life is that. We're mostly just hanging out single-celled organisms. We're mostly just hanging out as like hydrogen and whatnot. But for the parts that we have been living beings, mostly it's in the sort of bacterial archaea, simple cell type of lifestyle. Eventually, it is thought that cells figured out how to eat each other, and then once some guy ate some other guy, and the other guy that got ate was like, I'm not going to die, I'm just going to become organelles. And that's how you get eukaryotes. The biology majors in the room are having, which is all of you, may have opinions on that story, but that's roughly speaking what is what I believe happened. Eventually, these cells start to clump together. You get multicellular life. This is another great move. It probably started with just like algal mats, and then kind of sort of simple things like sponges, which have the line between bacterial eukaryotic colony and multicellular life, sort of murky as all this stuff is. At some point, well, between here and here, things start to develop another great idea, which is mouth. Mouth is opening, and between here and here, there's in is the same as out. There's only one opening, and sort of you're basically just like a tube. And you're not yet a tube. Around this time, this is sort of thought to be like hanging out around geothermal plumes at the bottom of the ocean. This has the advantage of being underwater, so you're protected from the radiation. Near warmth, because the geothermal plumes are hot, and there's also near weird chemistry, because the geothermal plumes are spitting out weird stuff from the center of the Earth. And so it's a pretty good move to just sort of anchor yourself to the spots near the plumes and just be a weird sort of worm-like creature. Which again is why I think it's really cool that when they flew, they found plumes coming off of Europa, big geysers, and they flew Cassini or something through the plumes and smelled the mist and found things like methane, which is a kind of thing that life makes, but not much else. So on Europa, there is beneath a crust of ice in a warm water ocean, there are things like geothermal vents spewing complex chemistry into space, but that's not important right now. Some other point, someone else made a very, I think, super important discovery, more of an organizational principle, which is to have two holes, one for in and one for out. That was a great move that I think we're all very grateful for. That's roughly where we still are. Basically, aside from all the details, you're all tubes with a bunch of weird stuff around it. And everything is sort of organized around that sort of central tube that goes in and out. And that is the origin of worms. Good friends worms, folks like C. elegans. There's a lot of worm people in this department. Biology has often studied worms. And then once you get to a particular worm named C. elegans, I don't think this is how this happened evolutionarily, but you get such a thing as a nervous system. Nervous systems have neurons. Neurons are cells that spike, and I don't really have time to get into all the details there. I've talked about it at some point, you've probably heard about it at some point. Nerves, very good, useful things. C. elegans has 302. Which is the smallest complete nervous system that we're aware of. I don't know how old they are, but they've been around for a while. Eventually, moving on from there, you get to another great point in time, which is sort of internal structure. So you start getting, I don't know the details here, but like you get your gastropods, you get your slugs, and you get your worms, and eventually you get your chordata, which is roughly speaking things with a spine. That's your, you also have like your mollusks and your clams and probably crabs at some point too, exoskeleton types. They're great, but they're not us, so we can sort of branch off from them. At some point in this process, I think maybe before the chordata, I'm not 100% sure on that, you get this invention of something else which is way less chill, which is predation. Someone figured out that if I can just sit around making my own body my whole life, it's very, very hard, very expensive. If I just eat you, then I can get all the energy that you've been growing your whole life, and then I don't have to do that. And somewhere in there you get the sort of the development of the predator-prey sort of arms race, and that is thought to be a major driver of evolution, because if all you're doing is sitting around sucking weird chemistry out of geothermal vents, there's not a lot of pressure to really be the biggest worm on the block. But if the biggest worm on the block starts trying to eat you, now you got to start trying to figure out how to deal with that situation. And that is sort of roughly speaking thought to be what we call the Cambrian explosion, which was a time the Cambrian period, where you just start seeing a whole ton of weird life showing up. You start seeing all sorts of much more speciated, much more advanced sort of organisms showing up, and at some point in that process you get the bony fish, which, oh, I did shut this down, that's too bad. So, oh look, a paper. Let's pretend I'm not on campus. One of the many ways that the harms of places like this are hidden from you is that when you're on campus, papers just show up. If you're off campus, it's like pay $40 to get this paper. So even when you're on campus, get in the habit of just taking the URL of the DOI, going to Sci-Hub, the specific URL changes so you can just search for it. Oh, not you. .mk? Yeah. This guy with the crow, punch it in there, punch it in there. And there you go. It'll look different because I have this dark reader extension that makes everything dark mode. Evolution of gaze shifting eye movements. I love this paper. This is a paper by Mark Land written in 2019. It may have been his last paper. He died of COVID, which is sad in a lot of variety of reasons. He's arguably my grand advisor. My advisor, Mary Hay, who I mentioned in the eye tracking stuff, studied with him. He did a lot of the original work on like eye movements and natural behavior. This paper is spectacular, and it basically talks about how everything in nature that has good vision has sort of a very similar saccade and fixate strategy that we do as humans. Saccades and fixations, a universal pairing. So this paper goes through and looks at, these look familiar to you? So these are eye movements, these are head movements, then you take head plus eye and you get gaze, which has these sort of stable moments out in the world. That's for the author's left eye looking around a room. This is the kind of papers you get to write if you're doing stuff like that. Then he compares this to other guys. So these are a goldfish making a turn. These are head movement, a rabbit tracking something. Birds are interesting for a lot of reasons, but not the least of which that their eyes are an appreciable percentage of the weight of their head. So we stabilize our gaze by having our big honking heavy heads and our thick, short, stiff necks move our head around, and we stabilize our gaze at the eye level. Birds have very long and flexible necks, so they stabilize their gaze at the head level, but they can't really make much eye movements. But they still have that sort of same like saccade and fixate style of gaze. It's just happening at the level of their heads. Do you ever look up those videos of people like moving a chicken around and the head stays fixed? It's VOR at the head level. It's a vestibulo-colic reflex. Colic for head. This is a chameleon. This is a rock crab. This is a stalk-eyed fly. And they're all kind of doing the same sort of thing because they're all using the same opsins, the same basic chemistry, the chemicals that respond to photons and light. They're all using the same basic chemistry there. And that opsins operate in roughly the same way, which is that they respond to light. They're very useful as these sort of biological light sensors, but they're relatively slow. Like it takes some tens of milliseconds for them to respond to light, and then some tens of milliseconds for them to like reset, which if you look at a bright light and then look away, that after effect is because your opsins in that part of your retina haven't reset yet. So Land argues that this saccade and fixate strategy is absolutely just like it's a fundamental aspect of having a good visual system, so he argues. And he argues by talking about this guy Walls, who wrote a paper in 1962, which I tried to read. It's just like it's like that old style, so it's just very, very long with like no pictures. So I trust Mike Land to have told me that the argument there is that we have evidence for the origin of eye movements stretching back to the bony fish, which is roughly 450 million years ago. Tree of life. Yeah, this is the one I want. Open. Perfect. There we go. So, these are those fishy guys. So the way you read this is this is Earth birth. And then the outer, each one of these rings is like time goes outward from this space. And so you start with these bacteria and these archaea and these eukaryotes. Plants show up. Plants are useful. We eat those. They're great. They eventually turn the atmosphere into oxygen, which causes a climate catastrophe, and things poison themselves because oxygen is like really intense. But we get over that. There's also a period of time in our history called the Carboniferous period, which is the space between the evolution of plants and the evolution of fungi, which is basically a period of life on Earth where plants are out here, specifically woody plants, are out here making cellulose, which is really hardcore, like chemically bonded. And when they die, there's nothing on the planet that knows how to break those cellulose bonds. So all the plants that die just hang out on the ground, and they turn into things like petrified wood. They burn. There was apparently like wildfires that were the size of continents because forests would just die and just never go anywhere. They also turn into all fossil fuels. All the fossil fuels on the planet, these like repositories of like rarefied carbon chains, hydrocarbon chains, and oil and coal and stuff like that, is from this gap period here. And it's typically things like bogs and swamps and stuff like that, because the plant matter would die, but it wouldn't be broken up and sort of get back into the sort of ecosystem. It would sort of sequester there. So, fossil fuel, super useful. You can do a lot of stuff with it. Some problems with using it too much too fast. We'll see how that goes. But then eventually fungi show up and they know how to eat cellulose. And so the Carboniferous period ends, and now trees can rot and go back into the carbon cycle. And thanks for y'all. Protostomes, these are your weirdos. This is like the weird Cambrian explosion. Like, if you ever look at like old animals, they're weird as hell. They have like weird spirals. There's like spiral mouthed things. This is from that like Cambrian explosion era. See this, how things kind of just like spike out there. Oh yeah, there was ice ages, it's fine. Mass extinction events, there's a bunch of mass extinctions, but it's okay. Right around here, these are your bony fish. These are the first guys that made eye movements, presumably. It could be that some of the other guys did too, but there's also this issue where bones make fossils, shells make fossils, slugs don't make good fossils. So there were probably guys, there's eye stalks and things like that, but bony fish have a skeleton, bony fish have a spine, bony fish have muscles, and those muscles are attached to eyeballs, and so eye movements roughly around here. Doing great. Biologically. At some point, we decide that we don't like the ocean anymore. It's too crowded, people keep eating us, they have weird mouths, so someone decides to crawl out onto the land. That guy was basically like a sort of a mud skipper type of fish, thought to be they would go out, lay eggs, go back in, and that keeps your eggs from getting eaten, because the only thing on the ground are these plants hanging out. And they don't eat anybody, they're chill. They just suck up light and do the Krebs cycle, which is super inefficient, but it works. Eventually, the guys decide that they like going out onto land, and they their flippers become hands, and their back flippers become feet, and they're crawling around, and they're lizard-like guys. This is the birth of tetrapod. These are the first tetrapods. Tetrapods are roughly this shape. head, torso, upper arms, lower limbs. Tail, optional. Well, I guess it's a spine sort of thing. Yeah. So those guys hung out for a long time. And then eventually they become, so you get your dinosaurs, you get your birds. Birds are basically the first bipeds. They beat us to the punch there by 200 million years. They are better at bipedalism than we are. I spent a lot of time in grad school arguing the opposite. I have come to terms with the fact that 200 million years of evolution makes you good at having 2 feet. They have like the very short femur, very long shank, and then the sort of like whatever the name of that sort of toe joint thing, TMJ, whatever that stands for. Yeah, they don't have a backwards knee. It's their ankle. Their knee is up, usually in their plumage. So that's fine. So yeah, they hang out for a while. They become, you got your dinosaurs with 2 legs. You got your sort of quadrupedal dinosaurs. They hang out for a good long time. Eventually, you get probably roughly one of these mass extinctions comes along. You get such things as the Gulf of Mexico as a result, and all the dinosaurs tend to die off or become birds. Those are their options, and a lot of them chose death, and some of them chose bird, and we are grateful we trust them to make those decisions for themselves. Now, amongst the little crawly boys, some of them were developing things like fur and warm blood. The first mammals were basically tree shrew looking things. Sort of like squirrel-like guys hanging out in trees. Arboreal, they hang out in trees, they run around on branches. Now, this is a great move for us eventually, because if you're hanging out on branches, then you're gonna need to have grasping because the trees are very thin. And so as these guys are running around the tops of trees trying to avoid getting eaten by dinosaurs, they're small, so they don't need much food. They're warm-blooded, so they're more resilient to sort of massive climate upheavals. And as the dinosaurs are all dying because of the invention of the Gulf of Mexico, these guys are doing just great. And so as they're running around in the trees with their little hands and their little feet, and eventually they turn into something more resemblant of, not that. There's another picture here, this one. You get all sorts of weird ones. You get your platypuses, your echidnas, sort of your strange animals, and eventually you get to such guys as primates. Primates sort of basically souped up tree shrews. I'm not sure exactly what to say about that transition there, other than like we did it. And we're going to go into some more detail about that particular transition. So we go from being arboreal, walking around in trees with grasping hands. And then primates are, I'm not sure what the term is, but they go back and forth. They hang out largely in trees, but they also come down to the ground. They're not very good at being bipeds. They can stand upright, but their skeleton isn't really shaped right. So they're knuckle walkers. So they're quadrupedal on these kind of like grasping appendages that kind of like, this is kind of how they do. We'll go into detail there. Quite some detail. So yeah, so we have now gotten from roughly Big Bang down to these grabby handy tree shrews, mammalian grabby tree shrews. This is a very good place to be. We are mammals, and this guy, the current guy, and the previous one from, God, that would be probably 20 million years ago. I'm talking about like my childhood. Like, God, can you remember back in that day? This is a mammal. It has a mammalian nervous system. It is roughly the same pieces and parts as yours. Very funhouse mirrored. Some parts are bigger, some parts are smaller. But this guy has roughly your same skeleton, roughly your same organs, roughly your same nervous system, roughly your same eyeballs. And everything from this point on is just sort of funhouse mirror stretching and pulling into other forms. And for now, I'm gonna find this Sagan. So this guy's Carl Sagan. Carl Sagan is the best. Carl Sagan is one of my favorite science communicator of all time, easily. Yeah, and he has this show called Cosmos. Highly recommend watching it. It's super dated, so you kind of have to just get past the fact that it was made in the 80s. But if you like the whole existential anxiety component of this class, this is really going to do you quite well, because it's all about his sort of like trying to make peace with the fact that it's just we're just not up for the task. That's what the whole show is about. And it had this very famous animation, which I will present to you. What has changed here? By the way, this like speed run through from like the birth of time until the evolution of humans, this is like a classic move, and it's kind of inspired by this. So like, how well do you know your creation myth? No. Let's do it on YouTube. No, not that 8-minute one. There you go. So. No. Lipid bilayer, organelles, eukaryotes, multicellular stuff. This is the mouth. That's the rock one. These are the guys that hang out by the geothermal vents. They become kind of worm. This is the fish. And get the hands, bony fish, skeletons, eye movements, crawl out of the water. Lizard guy, Dimetrodon. Some sort of tree shrew. This is your tree shrew. These are your old school apes with the tails. These are your new school apes without the tails. They stand up, they walk around. Hello, now we're here. We did it. And as he says, these are some of the things that molecules do given 12 billion years of evolution. Ta-da. Yeah, the cosmic calendar is what he did. And this little pixel right down here, that's all of life on Earth. Yeah. Dive into that pool at your leisure. It is your birthright. Okay. So, after the tree shrews, we get the apes. Apes and monkeys and apes. The term monkey is not an evolutionarily distinct thing. It evolutionarily, actually I can do this, I don't need to draw this. Primates. Old world, new world. So notice the Eurocentric imperialism in the naming conventions here, but you have your old school old world monkeys, which old world monkeys is like Africa. New World monkeys is the Americas. And the Old World monkeys, the other ones are, you got your macaques. So when we do research on non-human primates, it's typically macaques. That's your bamboos, your baboons, and your whatnots. Then you have your apes, which is your gibbons and your orangutans, and you have your great apes, which is us, gorillas, bonobos, and chimpanzees. So the term monkey isn't on here except as in this distinction between Old World and New World monkeys. So monkeys doesn't exist phylogenetically. If it did, we would be monkeys, which I mostly just use to, if anyone ever says, we're not monkeys, we're apes, be like, well, actually, you can hit them with that if you so choose. But yeah, so let's see, hard to do. Okay. And then now I'm gonna go here because I know that they have, there we go. So, bunch of skulls. We are born, we have skulls. Time is going back here, so this is the past and this is the future. This is actually starting a little later than I would want. So this guy right here is Australopithecus afarensis, otherwise known as A. afarensis. A. afarensis Lucy. You hear sometimes about this cool lady named Lucy, and she is, roughly speaking, a bipedal ape. The actual Lucy that we refer to is a skeleton that we found. I think this is actually at UT Austin. I'm not quite sure. Typically, when we find these remains, they're not complete. Like, we don't find them looking like this. We find little chunks and pieces. Lucy in particular, we got this, which is very complete for in sort of fossil record style. And Lucy she was famous because we found a very good complete skeleton, but there were a bunch of these sort of bipedal ape-like creatures, just all sorts of them. We keep finding new of them. You can tell kind of so the genus is the first word and then the species is the second one, or both, or whatever. We're homos, but then we have all these other ones. So Australopithecus is like a particular genus, but it gets murky. Like the separation is hard to really carve out because you usually get these like just bone chunks, and you keep finding new ones. Like, we recently found a ton of Homo naledi. Just like we found a cave that's just stuffed full of them. Google it, it's great. The cave, you have to be, the research team had to be a bunch of really tiny people because they had to be able to crawl in through the small spelunky holes. But let's go back one step further from this and talk about Artie. Ardipithecus ramidus. Ardipithecus ramidus. And less popular than Lucy, but still pretty good. Ardipithecus ramidus means the grounded ape. This is thought to be the last ancestor that we share with the other great apes. So Lucy is not in the family tree of chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas. Ardipithecus ramidus is. And Artie was able to stand up pretty okay, had some sort of the pelvis, we'll talk about the pelvis in a second here, but wasn't a particularly well-adapted biped. Notice the feet. Got these graspy feet things. This, unfortunately, is going to be the class where I take my shoes off. Not quite yet. But if you'll notice, the the grabby tree shoes, they still have the grabby on the feet, which means that this guy was thought to be a sort of a bad weather biped, basically. The what's it called? Africa? You heard of that place? Where we're from? Lucy was found in the Olduvai Gorge, which is in Tanzania, which we will talk about briefly. But so this is Africa. You may have heard of it. This right here is called, it's like the Great Something Rift or something like that. And it basically, like, it's geologically very active, and it sort of like pulls apart and pushes together over the scale of like thousands of years. And so this will periodically become kind of like this, which is like a bunch of like rivers and lakes and stuff like that. And then it will push together and become plains and things like that. So if you are an arboreal guy that lives in the jungle, it's sometimes you might need to come down from the trees and walk from this clump of trees to that clump of trees. And to do that, you might have to go across plains where there's things like lions and stuff like that. So it's probably pretty good to be a little bit better at walking so that you can go from one tree copse to another and not get eaten in the vicinity of that. The second you start doing that, you start getting these very well-evolved appendages that you've been evolving for all these millions and millions of years, but now for some of your life, you're not actually using them for anything. Like they're attached, they're very good at grabbing, they're very attached to our perceptual system because of the arboreal thing. But we're no longer using them for locomotion, which is a bold move. Kind of looks like riding a skateboard here. Does that, no one see that? Just not relevant. And so yeah, so Artie is thought to be kind of like the beginning of the evolution of obligate bipedalism. Obligate means like we don't really have many other choices here. Like bears and chimps and gorillas, they're mostly knuckle walkers, but they can stand up on 2 feet. We kind of suck at everything but bipedalism, so we are obligate bipedals, obligate bipeds. There's this great paper by this guy. I don't know why this doesn't quite work. Once again, grab the link, go to Sci-Hub. Second one down, I guess. So there's this paper. So this guy, C.O. Lovejoy, is a paleontologist. He does a lot of stuff on human evolution. He has this great 3-part paper on the evolution of human gait and posture that talks about the spine and pelvis and femur and knee and stuff like that. A lot of what I'm going to be saying about the skeleton is sort of based off of that. But he wrote this great paper about Ardipithecus ramidus in 2009. Because Artie was discovered relatively recently too. It's sort of like, you'll hear this thing every so often. We found a missing link. It's like, yeah, great, we found another one. But he wrote this paper about the evolution of bipedalism, which has what is perhaps my favorite section, my favorite paragraph I've ever read. So one of the things that happens a lot in this area of research or human evolution is everyone's always trying to sort of like, these days we try not to like lean too hard into it, but there's always this kind of question about like, what does our history say about us now? And one of the sort of core essential questions of like, are we just sort of like inherently violent monsters by nature? Or are we, or is the sort of the care and kindness part of us, is that also core? Are we fighting against our nature when we do care and kindness? Or is that inbuilt as much as the violence and death? And often that is kind of, if we look at our nearest cousins, we have chimpanzees and bonobos. Chimpanzees are relatively violent creatures. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but perhaps my favorite living scientist, what's her name? Jane Goodall, did a lot of really important work in discovering that chimpanzees are not just pure violent. They have like complex social structures and things like that. Story of that process is one of my favorites, but I'm not going to lean into it too hard right now. But generally speaking, chimps are very violent. Bonobos tend to solve their problems through gentler means. So there's this question of like, where do we really live? Like we do not evolve, like we're separated from them. We didn't come from either of them. We are of the same family. So this paragraph here was asking about like how the origins of bipedalism plays into that story of like the inherent violence or the not so violent life. I'll read it in full. A frequent explanation for the canine reduction in bipedality, so we have crappy teeth, we're bad at biting, is that handheld weapons replaced the SCC, which is superior canine something or another, pointy teeth. Handmade weapons replaced the SCC, but if male-to-male agonism had been fundamental to early hominid fitness, what selective agency would have reduced its signature character, the bitey teeth? Additional human attributes belie the improbability of the weapons argument. The absence of sperm competition in gorillas and orangutans is accompanied by a dramatically reduced testes size and the elimination of a free scrotum. Their testes are more judiciously sequestered in a post-penile bulge. In contrast, not only are human scrota more pendulous than even those of the chimpanzees, but bipedality makes them extraordinarily vulnerable during upright combat. It seems illogical to attribute habitual uprightness to weapons that would demand even greater selection for testes sequestration than is present in other primates, which target them with their functional SCCs. So the argument here is that the fact that we are bipeds with pendulous testes, not all of us, but some of us, is argument that at this point in our evolution, the main determinant of our survival was not our ability to kill other bipeds and chew their parts off. So I find it's like the most, what's the word? Hopeful. It's like this is the hope for humankind, is our secondary pendulae and wimpy little teeth. Anyways, moving on. So Ardipith, you just missed a great part. So Ramidus comes along, early biped, walking around, still ape-like, not a proper biped. Lucy shows up, and Lucy is a proper biped. Where's that part I missed? Here's the picture. So these are the homos. These are the pan-troglodytes, which is the chimps and the bonobos. And then this is where Ardipithecus hangs out. I guess not the gorillas. I guess Artie was not a gorilla fan. I'm going to talk about the Laetoli footprints before the rest of it. So, actually, no, I'm not. So, these are three lower bodies, the bony parts of the lower bodies, and this one is roughly speaking you. These are modern humans. This one here is the Australopith, like A. afarensis, that's your Lucy's, and then this is your chimpanzees, your pan-troglodyte. And the thing to notice here is that there's a lot of things that are different here. The main one to notice first is the pelvis. Our good friend C.O. Lovejoy said another one of my favorite lines, which is that the human pelvis is the most phylogenetically distinct osteological structure in the animal kingdom. Phylogenetically distinct meaning like evolutionarily weird, osteological structure, bony chunk in the animal kingdom. Because there's really not another analog for a creature that has a pelvis that looks like this. And the main thing to notice is it's small, it's squat, and it's got these big swoopy wing things. These are your anterior, your iliac spines. This is different from most pelvises in the sort of mammalian kingdom, at least, even outside, where the ilia are sort of more flat along the back. Not that. And the effects of this, so this is it looks like a gorilla or chimp leg with muscles, and this is a human leg with muscles. And one of the main features there is that the AP parts, you get all this really powerful musculature for the back, and it sort of squeezes the spine in. So you get these very stiff but extremely strong backs, but you cannot stand all the way up. So just the nature of the musculature means that, like, that's why if you look at videos of chimps and gorillas walking, they tend to walk like this. So when they can get their center of mass over their base of support, which, as we know, is important for standing and walking, but they do it by, like, this is tiring. Like, I can't really do this for very long because, you know, the legs are bent and whatnot, and so I have to be using my muscles to stand up here, whereas we have these ilia are sort of wide open on the top, so we get this sort of swoopy spine, lordosis spine. This is one of the many ways people will tell you that you're busted, but this sort of backwards bendy spine right here, this is healthy. Your lordosis is a thing that you need. You don't want a flat back. So we have your cervical, I forget the term, but there's the spine bends, it's 3 times. Once at the neck, around the thorax, and then here around the lumbar, and then our little sort of false tail, wimpy tail things. And so because we don't have those ilia running up our back, we have our ilia sort of more on the sides, we get these sort of really flexible spines, and that allows us to stand upright over our base of support with everything all lined up. And so I'm using my muscles now, but only, like, you know, to keep the limbs from flopping out. Mostly right now, I'm standing on my bones. So we get that from our spines, or the flexibility of the spine, which are freed up by the pelvis. And then we also, because of the sort of swoopy nature on the outside of the pelvis, we get all these great attachment points for this type of motion, abduction. So you got abduction, which takes it away, adduction, which takes it towards, very stupidly named degree of freedom, but we get a lot of this. So very useful, again, for being able to, like, control your body when you're standing on one stumpy part. We also get this, which is called the carrying angle, versus this, which is how you would probably, if you were to draw, like, a skeleton naively, you would probably draw it like this. You think of your legs as coming straight down from your hips. But we don't actually stand like that. We can put our feet happily in line directly under our hips, despite the fact that my hips are like 45 centimeters wide, and but I can happily, comfortably put my feet together beneath them because we have this carrying angle that where our femurs sort of cut in. And you can see that in your body is if you look at your knee, the inner bulb, the inner condyle, is bigger. Like, we've known this about your knee for a long time. It's lumpier on the inside than it is on the outside. And that's so that when it cuts in like this, it sits flat on top of the tibia, which is where your lower limb is. So that carrying angle is what allows us to stand with our feet directly under our center of mass as we are standing upright with these weird sort of spindly behaviors. Very precarious, but we get pretty good at it. The other thing we get, and I'm going to do it now, sorry, is we get feet. So you have probably at one point in your life wished that you could grab things with your feet. You can a little bit, but we're bad at it. But if you look at your hand, there's sort of 2 main axes, right? You have this grasping axis, and you have this opposable thumb. That's the opposable side of it. And because we have 2 axes, we can move them relative to each other and have a whole grasping area. And our good friends, the apes, have that same sort of arrangement. So they have the graspy feet, but there's always going to be a trade-off. So the thing that they don't have, so basically this thing right here is called your big toe, and fancily called your hallux, H-L-L-U-X. It is unbelievably strong relative to the rest of your body. Like my whole body weight, I can just rep it on my big toe and like these little, the other toes there. And so what happened is that in the evolutionary time, as we sort of stopped being arboreal and we started becoming obligate bipeds, we sort of became much more accustomed and acquainted to the ground. And so rather than having these sort of really finely tunable sort of graspy appendages, we took that strong axis and moved it in line with the long axis of the foot. And so instead, so now we don't get a grasping dimension, but because we have aligned all of the force angles of our foot with the direction of locomotion, we get incredibly fine force control. Our ability to control the forces under our feet is very, very, we are specialized at being able to control the forces under our feet. And that was so helpful to us that we gave up the ability to grasp by just moving the thumb in line with the long axis of the foot. So now as we are walking through the world, as we sort of hit the ground with our heel typically, and the center of pressure moves from the back of your foot to the front of your foot, you can control that force and that center of pressure with a lot of power and a lot of precision, though very finely, through those corticospinal tracts and sort of all those various things that happen. So we are able to sort of manipulate those physics, the center of pressure, center of mass kind of physics that we've been talking about all semester, because we have given up our foot grasping thumbs for this weird, wacky, super powerful hallux guy right there. Okay, shoes back on. How are we doing? We're doing okay. I knew this was going to take pretty much the whole time. Yes, and so now, in the spirit of, so with Nusi, we're like 6-ish million years ago, 6 to 7 million years ago. See, graspy. I also recently threw my back out, which is a thing that happens, which is sort of like another one of the big disadvantages of the wiggly spine move. So it's sort of like I'm here like, oh look, we have our flexible spines. I'm like, man, like chimps don't throw their spines out. Like their upper back, like their lats connect like straight to their pelvis, like roughly speaking, which is like that why they're so strong relative to us, because their muscle attachments allow them to be, but they lose precision, and that's true on the neural level at some level, but also just at the musculoskeletal level. Like the structure of that body is just it's power, not precision. Yeah, so Lucy is, so she's got all the same features that we do. Got our feet, got our pelvis, got our spine, got our knee, got our carrying angle. We also have a carrying angle on our arms, so we can, they hitch out so they sort of don't hit our pelvis. And she has that, chimps don't. And that leads us to, what's this picture? This is another one of my favorite archaeological finds in history. These are the Laetoli footprints. They were also found in the Olduvai Gorge, or near the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. And they represent a region of footprints from about 4 million years ago. And there's roughly 70 footprints in that region. Laetoli. And it was basically it was some area where there was some event happened, some volcanic event or just rain event or something like that. So there was this layer of like chuff, I think they call it, which is like strange wet mud. And during a particular sort of state of that mud, I think it's 3 hominids walked across that mud. 2 big ones and 1 small one. And if you believe the sort of poetic stories, it's a family. If you are less into that, we really don't have a good way to know. But there's 2 big ones and there's 2 big ones and a small one. And at one point in the walk, the small one starts walking in the footprints of the big one. And 4 million years ago, and they have, and so they do a lot of analyses of like the squish patterns of the, so they walked across and then something else happened and this got covered and the footprints fossilized, and then later on some European colonizer found them and wrote them down. So they were discovered, and then like they took scans, they took casts, they took all sorts of stuff, and then they reburied them because they couldn't take them out of the ground. So they marked them, they took a bunch of measurements, took a bunch of casts, and then put the dirt back over them again because they didn't want to remove them from the ground, and they also didn't want it to be like a tourist attraction because they didn't want it to get ruined. So these are still hanging out somewhere out near Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania, just being what they are. And so if they look at so this is a chimp walking. The back foot of a chimp, and you can see like that opposable foot. And the footprints that you see in the Laetoli footprints was someone that used heel-toe walking. So rather than doing like the sort of the whatever they do, they were walking heel to toe and sort of the center of pressure moving along the long axis of their foot, being controlled by this powerful hallux. And 4 million years ago, 3 folks walked across a muddy field, and now we can see them and we can think about why were there 2 big ones and 1 small one, and why did the small one walk in the footprints of the big one? It seems like something I might do if I was in a muddy field with someone else. If you walk through snow, that's how we do it through snow. And this guy wasn't us. Artie was not us. She was a different cousin friend. She was a chimp. She is no more close to us than a chimpanzee would be. But, we are related. So, yeah, so then we hung out, and so now we're on our branch now of the tree. There's no one else on this branch but us. No one else remaining on this branch but us. And there's a couple extra steps in here. So you get Homo erectus, which I think Homo erectus was called that. They were also a good biped, and but then like we discovered Lucy later, and she was like a better biped, and so not Homo, but she's Australopithecus. The distinctions there get murky for me. But then we get Homo habilis, Tullio. Not really. No one called him that, but I think it's funny. Homo habilis, people like to say, is the origin of tool use, but we don't really know, obviously. So the actual first tool user in our lineage is somewhere in this range, and we know that largely by just what they left behind. So mostly that comes in the form of stone tools, but if you think about, like, if you're out in the woods, what's the first thing you pick up? It's not necessarily a rock, it's like a stick. And if you're going out and you're killing animals, you might wear their fur. You might do stuff like that. None of that's going to leave a fossil in the same way that a good rock will. So a lot of the early evidence that we have for tool use comes from the form of stone tools. And there was a really great talk that I saw once from someone whose name I don't remember, couldn't find, of looking at, because we have a ton of evidence of these stone tools because these are literal rocks. We don't have to wait for some like fancy special like fossilization event. It's just a rock. So you can start looking for rocks that are basically like stone tools that are in places that you wouldn't expect old stone tools. Yeah. Actually, I think the author of this paper might be the guy I'm thinking about because I think this is what this is about. But But so the origin of these tools and the evolution of these tools fit a particular kind of, there was also an evolution that happened there. The first stone tools were just kind of like good rock. And they would find rocks in places that they really shouldn't be. And they would have wear patterns on them that they really shouldn't have through natural processes. And it seems like someone's like, I like this rock, I'm gonna carry this rock with me. Did they have a bag to put it in? Probably not the first ones, but eventually they probably did. And the bag didn't stick around, but the rock probably did. And the first, actually, and probably before, that's the hand axe era of human tool use. And that was, most of our evolutionary history was hand axes. They would also find these flakes. So something else that they would do is they would find particular rocks, and they learned which rocks would shatter well. And they would, after they would hunt and kill something, they would find these rocks and they would just smash them on the ground and pick up the sharp parts and use that to do the carving. So they weren't really shaping the rocks, they were just smashing and sort of like picking through the rest of the good stuff. And as you sort of go through the history here, I'm guessing about what this paper is, but you can see that there's sort of, the tools become more and more sophisticated over the course of like millions of years, aeon types of time periods. And it starts from just like, this is a good rock, and it goes to these like, these are good rock flakes. You would find rock flakes near you where you would find like evidence of some hunting. And then you would start to get like more and more advanced sort of tools which would have required more and more advanced cognitive abilities, until you get to like the latter parts like of the, you know, the stuff that we still use today in some sort of areas. The most modern form of stone tool use, where you would get these very, very complex things where in order to make that type of a tool, you can't just smash the rock. You can't just smash the rock and hope that it comes out sharp. You have to like shape it in a particular way. And then once it's ready, one big smack would would shear off the whole thing. And then you could start, that's how you would form these like really perfectly shaped things. And so the paper, if this is the one that it is, was the guy learning how to do that type of technique and realizing that once you get to a certain area, you're no longer doing like a stimulus response thing. Like you're planning ahead. Like you're doing this. Okay, now it's ready. And then one big smack to get it to shear off in a nice carvable blade. And so there's this interesting story of the evolution of our cognitive capacity that gets told through the complexity of the stone tools that we find scattered along the way. And again, just I think it's worth making the point again, if you were doing this, you're almost certainly doing other stuff too. You almost certainly have cool sticks and cool rocks and wearing furs. I can't imagine being able to do some of this without also noticing like, hey, I just killed that tiger and it's got a lot of fur and I'm cold. I think I'm gonna figure out how to do that. Like these are, at this point, they're still not like proper humans, but they're smart. And so they're probably doing stuff. If they were painting themselves, if they were doing something resembling art, we find cave art and stuff like that. Our ability to know that is lost because those things don't leave evidence. Yeah, and then you get this, a cacophony of homos, which is not the proper term for that, but that's the time to just get all of these homos, Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis, Homo sabida, blah, 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 Homo ergaster. They're overlapping with some of the Australopithecines, Homo erectus, Homo naledi, that's the ones we found in that cave. Homo heidelbergensis, this one they call, I think that's the one they call the Hobbit, like it's little guy. Homo neanderthalis, and then Homo sapiens. This one's us, but also some of these guys. It seems like there's some mix there. There were a bunch of them. It's a pretty good body type, and it was very effective. And there were a bunch of homos running around the Eurasian continent for a good long time, and then they died. Somehow or another, they all just died out except for us. There were certainly some extinction events. There were some pretty narrow bottlenecks at some point where they say like down to like 25,000 some odd breeding pairs of whatnot. But for some reason, we don't really know, we're the only one left. A lot of them died off. We might have killed some of them. We probably interbred with Neanderthals. We all have some percentage of Neanderthal DNA. If you're like, wait, I thought different species couldn't breed together. It's like, well, that's speciation's kind of complicated and murky. So we don't really know. But we do know that it's just us left. The bipedal hand-wielding sort of thing, it condensed down to this. The questions of why Homo sapiens won out, why there's Homo sapiens, there's not Homo neanderthals, because we lived at the same time as these guys. These guys were bigger than us. They had bigger brains, not necessarily bigger brain to body ratio, but bigger brains. And it's thought that kind of like we were smaller, so we survived ice ages better. Or we just kind of like, we overlapped and then just interbred and there was just more of us. So we stopped finding distinct ones of these and started finding mixed ones of those. Who knows? And then that's the question marks. Who knows? Like, it's hard to know how we got there. So here we are now. We're these bubble-headed, soft-toothed, kind-hearted jog monsters is kind of one of the things there. There's a lot of evidence around the early Homo sapiens that we started becoming nice in some way, shape, and form. Like, we find skeletons of humans that had like bone disorders that would have been basically like immobile their entire life. So if they lived to be the age that they were when we found them, there was somebody taking care of them that entire time. We find burials of skeletons with like really valuable, really well-carved stone tools in the grave with them. So somebody loved this person enough to give up a very valuable tool when they walked away from it. And there's all sorts of other stuff. One of our many superpowers is that we have like a healing factor relative to other animals. We heal much better than most creatures. And evidence for that from like these skeletons they were busted up. Like a lot of these old school humans, like they broke their bones all the time. And so you find these evidence of like bones that broke and then rehealed. And during that time, that person was useless. They were not contributing to the group while they were healing from an injury at that scale. So somebody was taking care of them. So even though we were horrifying creatures, like we dominated the landscape by basically being able to jog indefinitely. That's kind of one of our things is we like show up and the deer sprints and we jog and we learn how to throw. This was a power move. Big problem for the world because it's like you're over there, but I have like these like this very mobile, powerful, dexterous joint coupled to a very precisely accurate visual system. So if all I have to do is get close enough to the deer to hit it with a rock, and then it sprints off, and then I jog after it, and then I get close enough to hit it with another rock, and it doesn't take very long before that deer stops being able to sprint away, and I just keep on jogging in. It's horrifying. Persistence hunting, if you want to look that up. Yeah, and that's, is there anything else to say there? Yeah, so I also want to mention about the skull. The skull is important. The skull is an important part, right on the top there. And the thing that was mentioned in that gorilla skull. So humans are considered to be very weakly sexually dimorphic, meaning that the differences in body between male, female subtypes is very limited. We are super tuned to it, so it looks big for us, but on the sort of zoological scale, basically the same. Gorillas, not that way. And I wanted to, and so male, female. This is not just something I forgot to say earlier, but so this is the male gorilla, that's the female gorilla, smaller and sort of smoother head. But the thing I really want to point out is this. This is called a sagittal crest. And this is present in a lot of animals, especially like the bitey ones. And it's basically an attachment point for the jaw muscles. So for a gorilla, they have that pointy head. And other animals have this too. If you have a dog, feel on their head, they'll have a sagittal crest. Cats have kind of a pretty wimpy one. But it's basically an attachment point. So the jaw muscles go from here through the cheekbones and attach up top there. And so this is sort of part of our wimpy bite, is that we gave a lot of that up. So if you find your jaw muscles here, so like on the edge of your jaw and like squeeze your teeth, you can find your jaw muscles. It goes up through like under the cheekbones. And then if you put your hands kind of on your temples here and bite again, you'll find where where they attach. Take that part and kind of push it together. Don't do it in reality, but imagine doing it. And where that meets is going to be something like that. And so we suck at biting relative to other animals. Like, don't bite anybody. I mean, follow your heart, but don't. If you had to choose between getting bit by a person or getting bit by a chimpanzee, person all day, because we gave up a lot of that real estate to have those muscle attachment points. You know, because if in the same way that you can imagine pushing those muscle points, those those jaw muscle attachment points together into something like a sagittal crest, now imagine poofing this part out. So this this sort of brain part there, the brain part, if you're the details, this part here, just sort of blow up that bubble. And that's basically what happened for us. And so we got a lot of extra real estate in the dome for our weird, lumpy, dense, complicated brain. But by doing so, we gave up a lot of that real estate for being able to bite. So back to that sort of story about the pendulousness of our forebears. That was sort of part of the question. It's like, at some point, we stopped being good, like, sort of like raw, like our ability to like kill each other with our bare bodies got worse. And so this question of like, what happened in that region? So Lovejoy talks about the weapons hypothesis, which is like, well, we didn't need the teeth anymore because we had the weapons. But then he's like, but that story actually doesn't really track because of the pendulousness argument. And so what we get to probably what's a pretty decent end to this weird story, which is that it seems that the actual thing that we developed, which allowed us to dominate, allowed us to kill much pointier animals and be the thing that is sort of everywhere and sort of learns how to go to space and learns what stars are and things like that, was our ability to be kind social animals. Like we worked together with people, we took care of them when they were ill, and we let them walk in our footprints when we had to. And that's sort of the story of how we got here. And yeah, that's about that. I think that's about the story. That's human evolution in a nutshell. Got 6 minutes left. Does anybody have any questions? I know this is like in a lecture that typically doesn't have like Q&A, like asking people for questions. It's like no one's ever going to do it. But just pretend like I'm an AI. Like what? Imagine like what would you have typed into the chat bot and just find your heart and say it. Which part of that story sounds sus to you? Yeah.
I was going to ask something about like which is stronger. It's just like as simple as the number equation where arms compared to
So
the muscles actually.
yeah, so what was the equation you said? Lever equation. Yeah, it's complicated. is the answer. So like the attachment points and the leverage that you get from that is absolutely going to be a part of that. So just like the nature of like, if you're pulling from here down to there, that's going to be stronger than if you're pulling kind of around the corner there. But there's other stuff too. Like one of the things I really like is this is like, by the way, how Q&A happens in scientific context. You just wait for someone to ask a question. It reminds you something you wanted to talk about. Chimp hands. So like our tendons are fairly stretchy and thin, which gives us more dexterity there. Chimps have the resting state of our hand is this, like our with our fingers straight. Chimps and a lot of the other like tree climbing animals, their resting state is like that because the tendons are thicker and shorter. And so when they hang out like this. And so if you're grasping from that perspective, it's going to be stronger because like the rubber bands attached to it are thicker. And it's so they have very, very strong grip, but they lose some of that precision. There's also some evidence I've heard suggesting about like the distribution. This is now more neuroscience, like something about the distribution of like motor units in their muscles. We have lots and lots and lots of motor units like spread throughout our muscles, particularly in our hands and things like that. And when we are activating a particular joint, we do so by basically firing one of those motor units in the muscle. And so because we have so many, we have the ability to like do a gradient of that, so we don't fire them all at the same time, which gives us the ability to make small, subtle movements. My understanding is that chimps and things like that, it's much more all or nothing. So I think it's like kind of, I might be getting this wrong, but I think it's counterintuitively they have like fewer motor units because when they say grasp, they're always going to be grasping with close to their full strength, whereas we have the ability to have more gradient control. So there is the leverage aspect of just where the muscle attachments are. There's also like the complexity of like the tendons and stuff like that. And there's arguably possibly something going on at the level of the nervous system, like corticospinal tract kind of stuff, where it's like we have the ability to make our muscles do more fine-grained movements, which has a trade-off to being able to do like full power things. Because also it's like if you're always going full bore with every movement, then you're also going to develop more hypertrophic muscles over the course of your life. So there's this kind of like, there's the leverage, there's the actual musculotendon stuff, there's the neural structure, and there's like the lifetime of being a creature with this type of thing, of like where does the actual strength come from? So it's always going to be this kind of like overlapping, kind of weird story there. Is there something else I wanted to say on that? Probably. Yeah, okay. Thank you for the question. I always like to point out this just because it's like, it's literally just they have shorter, thicker tendons. And so they're better at this, which is good because they live that life. So yeah, there's this whole, like the interplay between like the musculoskeletal structure and the neural controller and the lifetime of experience, and like, it's always everything all at once. Yeah, and that's the class. So thank you. Thanks for showing up.